Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 652 for the 19th of Elul in a regular year. Today's episode has been generously sponsored by an anonymous listener in honor of her engagement. So mazel tov to her, mazel tov to this anonymous listener, and I'm so honored that you chose to sponsor this podcast to commemorate this very special occasion. And I wish you and your chassan to build a binyan nadei ad based on the foundations of Torah and mitzvahs, and you should just have many happy and productive lives together. If anybody else would like to sponsor a future podcast episode, then please feel free to reach out to me at itistaught@gmail.com, and you'll see a link there. If you have any questions about this, you can also reach out to me through the email. You can contact me on WhatsApp or Facebook, however it is that you can find me. I'm also on Instagram under It Is Taught. So lots of ways to reach out to me. And sponsoring the podcast is really just a really nice way to show your appreciation and motivates me to continue with this. There are quite a bit of expenses that go into the podcast, the equipment, the hosting site I have to pay monthly fees for. So just to give you guys a little bit of an idea. And with that being said, let's begin today's episode. So we've already touched upon different personality types in a previous episode. We spoke about the idea of how there are different systems. There's the Myers-Briggs system. There's the Enneagram system. And one thing that all of these different systems of trying to break down different personality types have in common is that there's a fundamental attempt at trying to break down the human being into different parts, different components. Like, what are the fundamental core emotions, core personality traits? And once we know what those traits are, we can talk about which traits are more or less dominant within a different individual. So interestingly, the Tanya actually addresses this idea as well, but the Tanya is coming at it from a spiritual perspective. So whereas some of these other systems are speaking about it from a more maybe just psychological perspective, like whether we're talking about your genes, what your DNA makes you up, or your life experiences, or different things like that. From a Tanya perspective, when we talk about personality traits, or when we talk about just different core emotions really within a person, we're talking about these things from a spiritual perspective. We're talking about them as having a spiritual root. And in this epistle that we've been studying in the past few days, Epistle 15 from Iggeres HaKodesh, we've been talking about this idea that when we look at man, when we study humanity, there's a parallel there to God. We spoke about yesterday that we don't want to take this parallel too far. Like, we don't want to make the mistaken impression that we actually are God, or that we have any true semblance to God. God truly is something that is truly beyond our comprehension. That we likened the difference between a trait that we experience down here, even if in its most sublime, superior form, such as the trait of kindness, as it was found in Avraham Avinu, who is the archetype of kindness, is compared to ashes in relation to the trait of kindness in its supernal, pristine state, just like ashes are compared to a tree or to a piece of wood. So there is a comparison there. Like, there's a relationship in the sense that the ashes really are the tree essentially. But on the other hand, it's like we can see how far off the two are from one another, right? So anyway, so now that we can keep that in mind, that it's like on the one hand, humanity does parallel God on a certain level, and in terms of giving us somewhat of an understanding of God, but not taking the analogy too far and giving us the misconception that we can truly, truly grasp God in an ultimate sense. But still, we can say, okay, it can give us somewhat of a semblance of that. So thus, okay, so now we have a project on our hands. That means if we want to try to understand God, so as explained by the Alter Rebbe, one way to get into that study of God, to get into that understanding of God, is by studying man, by studying humanity. And so today, that's exactly what we're going to begin to do. We're going to look at the topography of human emotions from a Kabbalistic perspective. And ultimately, this is going to lead us and guide us towards understanding God to the best of our ability. But for today, we're really going to look at it from a human perspective. And now, in addition to emotions, we also have intellect, right? We've spoken about this in the podcast a lot of times already, that there's the emotive attributes and then there's the intellectual attributes. 7 emotive attributes, 3 intellectual attributes. And so towards the end of the episode today, we're actually going to talk about the connection between the two. These aren't two distinct things. Actually, as we'll see, the emotions actually stem from our intellects. And indeed, we'll see that the quality of our emotions actually parallel the quality of our intellects. This doesn't mean that just because somebody's very smart, then they're going to have very, high level emotions. So it's not about being smart per se. It's about having a higher quality intellect, like having a refined intellect, which is different than being smart. And somebody who has a refined intellect that's going to translate into their emotions, and this is the idea of the moach shalit al halev, that the mind rules over the heart, that we really can, we don't have to be slaves to our emotion. We actually do have a certain level of say over our feelings, over our emotions, over who we are, by directing our minds in a particular manner. So with all of that being said, I would like to get straight into the text and kind of explain as we go, because there's a lot here, and I think it will just make more sense to kind of explain things as we go. For context, we are still in the middle of Epistle 15, and we're in the middle of that epistle, starting a new paragraph here. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that when we talk about that there are 10 spheres within the soul of man. So again, just to give a background on that. So we talked about this idea that the makeup of the entire universe, the building blocks for the entire universe, what God chose to use as building blocks for the entire universe are what are known as the spheres, the 10 spheres. Spheres is a really hard word to translate. Sometimes it's translated as like sapphires or spheres or something. The best way to think about it is 10 energy, like 10 different types of energy forces that God uses to create the world, to bring the world into being at all times. And we know that these 10 spheres are paralleled within the soul of man. And so now we've spoken about this. This should be a review for those of you that have been following along the podcast so far, that we have spoken about this, that we know that within the 10 spheres, there's actually subcategories. There's the 3 intellectual spheres that is the Chokhmah, Bina, and Das, right? And then there's the 7 emotive spheres, which are known as the 7 emotive attributes, the 7 emotions, we can think of them, or different traits, as we'll see. So the Alter Rebbe explains that he says it's known to all. So again, because this is something that comes up a lot in Chassidus, that the attributes, like the general attributes of man, are divided up into 7 general attributes. So what the Alter Rebbe basically is trying to tell us here is that, going back to personality types and all that kind of stuff, if you want to think about human attributes, think about different personality traits, like how you describe a person, like, oh, that person he's such a nice person, or that person, he's a bit harsh, or that person is so meticulous in what he does. He does everything so exacting in the right way. Or she is such a generous person. She has so many guests all the time. Or she's so diligent. She's such a hard worker. She's has a really strong work ethic. All of these things that we use to describe humanity, the Alter Rebbe basically is teaching us that they can be boiled down into 7 general categories. Of course, there's going to be details in that, because everybody is, there's a lot of individualism within that, and there's, different breakdowns of how these traits manifest and all that. That's kind of, that leaves a lot to be explored. But in general, there's the 7 primary general attributes. And the Alter Rebbe explains that he says that all of the particular attributes, like all the idiosyncrasies that a person has, they all come from one of these 7 attributes. So if any trait that you could think of in a person, you could say, oh, that trait that person has, like punctuality. Where does punctuality come from? That comes from one trait. Extroversion, where does that come from? Being a friendly person, that comes from another trait. So each trait, any trait that you can think of, comes from one of these 7 general categories. They're all rooted within there. So now we're going to learn about what these 7 general categories are. So we're going to start with the first one. The first one is the attribute of chesed, what we know as chesed. We spoke about this one a lot. It comes up a lot in Chassidus if you haven't noticed. So chesed is, again, translations, very difficult. So I'm going to try to use the Hebrew as much as possible, but it's often translated, just to give you an idea, as kindness, giving, generosity, kind of things like that, benevolence. So this idea of chesed, it's this trait of like, you can think of it as this like outpouring, this extroverted kind of like wanting to influence without any limitation. That's on the right side. That's like if you wanted to draw a map of this, like we call this episode the Topography of Emotion. So that would be like on the top right side. Then right next to it on the left side, on that same line, we have the next mitzvah, the second attribute, which we know as gvura. Again, gvura, difficult to translate, but it's often translated as strength. It's often translated as constriction, as limitation, that kind of thing. So the Alter Rebbe says this attribute of gvura is the ability to constrict the flowing so much to the point that it won't flow at all. So it's like there's a relationship between these 2 attributes in that sense. So it's like, let's say if you picture it as like chesed, which is often likened to water, it's like this outpouring of water, and it's like just gushing of water. And the gvura is like the dam that stops the water from flowing. The gvura holds it back to the point that it might hold it back entirely if the dam is thick or strong enough, right? Or depending on the placement of it or whatever. Okay, now we have the third attribute. What's the third attribute? The third attribute, again, in the topography. So you have chesed is on the top right, gvura is on the top left, and then on the next level down, in the middle of both of those, is the third attribute, which is known as rachamim. Rachamim translated as compassion, as empathy. And this is where a person can have compassion to whoever it's appropriate to have compassion upon. And this is considered to be an intermediate trait between gvura and chesed. So why is it an intermediate trait between the two? Because chesed is all about just overflowing, giving to anybody. Like it's like a giving person who's just so generous. They give to everybody. They don't ask, they don't do inquiries. Do they really need this money? Do they not need this money? You know, the type of person that, like, you know, when you see a homeless person on the street and people say, don't give to them because you're just supporting their drug addict. A total chesed kind of person isn't going to listen to that. They're just going to give to them anyways. They're going to give to everybody. They might give to a criminal, God forbid. Like they're not discriminating in who they give to. So they'll give to somebody to where it's not appropriate, like where you shouldn't be having compassion on such a person. So like, let's say if there's somebody who, like, there's nothing to have compassion about them, like they're not actually lacking in anything and they're not actually troubled, but the chesed person just wants to give. They just want to give, you know. I don't want to make too many parallels here because I feel like parallels can be really misleading at times, but maybe just to help understand this, anybody who's familiar with the Enneagram, what this makes me think of, lahavdil, is like the type 2 in the Enneagram who's all about giving. And the giving, actually, there's a selfish aspect of it because it's not actually an unhealthy 2, at least, if we talk about it in terms of health or unhealth. The unhealthy 2, or the self-serving 2, just gives not because the other person needs it necessarily. It's just because it feels good to them to give. Chesed enjoys giving. It's not about if the person needs what they're giving. Do they want it? Do they not? You know, the type of person who buys you a birthday present, they didn't even like necessarily see, is this something you need or not? It's just they're giving it because they like to give, you know? So obviously there's something nice about giving. We don't want to take away from that. But at the same time, there's something to be said about having that giving being tempered by this attribute of compassion. So this attribute of compassion is what navigates, is what monitors this interplay between how much to give, how much not to give, between the chesed and between the gvura. And this attribute, this mediating attribute of rachamim, another word for it is tiferet, which means beauty. So why is it called beauty? Because it can be likened to, when you think about different like beautiful clothing, by way of analogy. So let's say if you have clothing that is dyed in different colors, that are many different colors and they're mixed together, this is what's going to make it beautiful. Because we've spoken about this in a previous episode. If you have one thing, like what makes beauty, if you have something that's just too simple, if you had let's say a piece of clothing that was just one color, let's say, and that was just very plain. So here the Alter Rebbe is just talking about color, but let's take it really, let's say including shade and including dimension, which can really influence the color of the clothing, right? So let's say you had this piece of clothing that was just one color and there's no shades to it. There's nothing else going on. It might be fine, it might be nice, but we wouldn't necessarily say that it's beautiful, right? What this makes me think about is the idea of a uniform. If you look at school uniforms, military uniforms for different religions, often there's a certain, if you look at what that uniform is made up of, there's something bland about it. It might be presentable, it might be really nice, but people don't usually call a uniform beautiful. That's not the first thing people say about it. They might say it's really pleasant, it looks really clean, put together, whatever. And think about the word uniform, uniform, one form. So the whole idea of a uniform is for everybody to look the same. There's not much going on. So in order for clothing to be really considered beautiful, in order for something, if the most fashionable item out there, there's got to be some contrast. There needs to be something going on. There needs to be a difference of different colors, different shades, something, right? So keeping all of this in mind, this is how the trait of rachamim or tiferet acts in relation to chesed and gvura. So we can think of chesed and gvura as being those sort of uniforms. Maybe chesed would be a uniform that is just totally blue. Maybe we could say it's a navy blue, because I know that chesed is, each one of the spheres incidentally has a color that's associated with it, and chesed is likened to blue because it's likened to water. So let's say chesed would be that navy blue uniform. And then gvura is red. Gvura is associated with the red. So gvura could be a red uniform. And again, this is we're really taking it to the extreme, that it would be these very simple uniforms. And then tiferet would be where you would actually have the blending of those colors into different colors. And it would be making something more beautiful. So what that would mean emotionally is that, again, so chesed is that overflowing of love and kindness, too much, somebody who's just too generous, too giving without discrimination, without no regard for who they're giving to. Gvura is the withholding to the point that they never give to anybody. They're too much, too withholding, too judgmental, too severe. And then the tiferet comes in, and then the tiferet mediates between the two and is calm down, everybody, let's be reasonable here, let's figure out who to give to, who not to give to, how much should we give, all of that kind of thing, right? Okay, so that's the first three emotive traits so far that we got to. Now we're going to get into the next two. So in order to get there, the Alter Rebbe says that, so now we have to say, okay, so let's think of a practical scenario where, let's say it's a person has a certain amount of money and they're trying to decide what to do with it. Should they give it all away? Should they keep some of it for themselves? Who should they give it to? And all of that. So let's say the chesed part of that person wants to just give all the money away to whoever they meet on the street. First person they meet, they're just going to give it to everybody. The gvura doesn't want to give any of it away. The gvura wants to hold on to all the money. The tiferet says, hold on, everybody. Let's do some research. Let's find out who needs money the most. How can we use this money the wisest way, and in a way that it's not going to take away from our resources so that we won't be able to give in the future. So the tiferet is kind of mediating between all of this. And then the tiferet has made a decision. Let's say the person's decided based on something, this is who I'm going to give to, this is how much I'm going to give to, and all of that. So now we're coming to the point of the actual action where, okay, the person's going to they're getting ready to give. So it's not theoretical anymore. Now it's okay, so here I am. I'm getting ready to give. So now they need to figure out how to give, how to do this in such a way that the recipient will be able to receive what it is that they're giving. Meaning to say, so what would this look like? Why is it such a difficult thing to figure out how to give and how the recipient's going to receive it? So we gave the example of money, of giving money, but the Alter Rebbe actually here gives a different example. He says there's an example of giving over wisdom. So let's say a parent wants to give over a certain idea to their son. If the person will tell them the entirety of the wisdom, the son will not be able to accept it and receive it. So let's say, for example, let's say you had a 5-year-old kid and you wanted to teach your child, this 5-year-old child, about a very lofty topic. It could be about Tanya, about the things we're learning about, right? Or quantum mechanics or the theory of relativity, some really big idea. And the 5-year-old child is like sitting there. If you start throwing mathematical formulas at them, or if you start telling them these spheros without any context, if you're like, well, there's chesed and there's gvura and there's tiferet and there's spheros and there's atzilus and there's brit, the kid is going to look at you like, what are you talking about? And he's probably going to like run away very quickly, right? So actually you need to arrange it in a way. You need to be very organized in your thoughts, and you need to make sure that every word you say is very thought out. So actually one of the biggest compliments that I got from one of my listeners of this podcast, hi there, Terry, if you are listening right now, is that she told me I happened to see her on the street, and she told me that she really enjoys these podcasts, and that the phrase that kept popping out at her in thinking about the podcast is she thinks of these episodes as being very well crafted. So I took that as a huge compliment, and I think that's exactly what the Alter Rebbe is trying to describe here, is that if a person wants to give over a certain amount of wisdom to their son, or to anybody really, it's like they can't just like give it all over in a blah way. Like, you know, like I could just sit here and just read the Tanya to you guys in Hebrew, or even just sit and read the Hebrew, translate the Hebrew. Like, why would that be useful to you guys in a podcast? And it might actually come out not making a lot of sense. So a better way to do that is actually really think about these. That's exactly what I try to do, is that before every episode, I try to study the entry, the Tanya entry, and then really think about for a little bit, and think about what would be the best way to give this information over in an organized fashion. So the Alter Rebbe brings a citation from Mishlei to describe this, from Mishlei chapter 25 verse 11, where it says davar davur al ofnav, every word fitly spoken. So little by little, says the Alter Rebbe. So meaning there's this thing of like giving over the information in a little by little manner. So again, so if you wanted to explain to a little child about how gravity works, or about quantum physics, or about Tanya, or about anything, it's like you need to give over the information to them in a very small manner, in a very easy and palatable way to understand. So for gravity, you might take a pen and show them how the pen falls to the ground. Wow, that's so cool. How does the pen fall to the ground? Quantum mechanics, you might think like, wow, how is it possible to explain quantum mechanics to a child? But you can start talking about the idea of probability. You can take a die and you can show the child that the die has 6 sides to it. And then you say, okay, we're going to throw this die up in the air, or we're going to roll the die. What number do you think the die is going to fall on? And what are the chances you think that die is going to fall on that number? And you can begin opening up this conversation about probability to really get into a deeper understanding and deeper discussion of quantum mechanics. Yes, even with a 5-year-old child. So there you go. I gave you guys a tip. If you ever want to explain quantum mechanics to a 5-year-old child, that's a gateway for you guys to get there. Or for Tanya, you can talk about the idea. You can start talking about the idea of feelings. And sometimes you feel sad. Sometimes you feel happy. Sometimes you feel like doing the right thing. Sometimes you feel like doing the wrong thing. These are all ways that you can make these concepts palatable to a 5-year-old child. So this whole idea of making things palatable, making where it's like you have things that you want to give, but how now you know that you want to give, you've made this decision in your Tiferet of what it is that you want to give and who you want to give to, whether we're talking about wisdom, whether we're talking about money. So the same thing in terms of money. So it's like, let's say you decide, okay, yes, I do want to give a certain amount of money to a certain charity. You have to figure out how you're going to do that. Are you going to write a check? Are you going to give the money all at once? Or are you going to give it step by steps? Are you going to give it all from one account? How are you going to go about doing that? So this whole deliberation, this whole process also has a place in this topography of emotions. Where is it found? It's found in the emotions of the Netzach and Hod. So those in our map, if we want to go back to our map, we have, again, so we have at the very top, the top right corner is Chesed, the top left corner is Gvura, the middle level, the level right below that, in the middle of both of them, is Tiferet or Rachmim, and then next level below that, so now we're on the third level here, then the right side over there is called Netzach, sometimes translated as winning, as endurance. Again, these words are not so perfect. And then on the left side, on the bottom, is Hod, sometimes translated as humility, as submission, that kind of thing. And these two traits of Netzach and Hod, they are what are referred to as the Klayot Yoatzot, the kidneys that advise. That comes from Brachos, from the Gemara in Brachos, page 61a, the Klayot Yoatzot. And interestingly, according to the Zohar, these are thought of to be the testicles that actually prepare the sperm. So there's a physiological relationship between all of these attributes as well. So in this case, we really can think of it as being the testicles that prepare the sperm, which, according to Kabbalah, the sperm actually comes from the brain. It's a drop that issues ultimately from the brain. So the Alter Rebbe is going to explain this, going back to that analogy, going with that analogy of where you had, let's say, a father that wants to give over a certain idea, a certain concept over to his son. So if you think about it, so what is it? So the father has this, like, let's say he is a quantum physics professor and he has all this knowledge in his head, and it's like a ton of knowledge, years and years and years and books and thousands of papers that he's read, and he wants to give it over to the son. What he ends up giving over to the son is actually a very, very small, minute drop of his intellect. So really we can think of this in terms of the sperm, in terms of the drop of semen that comes out as a result of that, is coming from a place of a lot more. But what actually comes out is just a drop. And in this process of this transformation, of this coming down, then it's the concept is going to change somewhat from being so subtle, like in the father's mind. So in the father's mind, he understands all the nuances, all the subtleties of quantum mechanics. He's giving it over to his child. And now what does the child know? Okay, so far all he knows is that when you roll a die, there's a certain amount of times it might fall on 2, there's a certain amount of times it might fall on 3, whatever. It's not going to be as subtle or nuanced, but this is in order for the son to be able to encapsulate in his mind, in order for him to really be able to have some kind of grasp of understanding of it. And so this is really, says the Alter Rebbe, the way that we can really understand the way that this drop of semen comes from the brain. So originally, this drop of semen, as it's found within the brain, is very subtle. It's very tenuous. But then it becomes more and more physical as it comes through these testicles. Then it becomes something a little bit more corporeal. So hopefully that can give you a little bit of a visual of how this process of Netzach and Hod happen, what the role that they play in terms of bringing down this intellect into actuality, into making it more palatable to the outside, or whatever it is that we want to give to the outside. And now another reference, another term that the Netzach and Hod are referred to is they're referred to as shchakim, which means grinders. And they're also called rechaim, which is millstones. And why is this? Because they grind the manna for the righteous. So I believe that this is a citation from the Gemara in Chagiga, page 12b. So there's this idea of that. Okay, so grinding the manna for the righteous. So what do we mean by this? So the Alter Rebbe explains, just like if we think about physical grinding of wheat with a millstone that crumbles it into many parts it makes it very fine, makes the wheat very fine. So too, this is what happens when a person needs to make their intellect into something very, very small, and they want to convey it over to their son into many different parts, and to give him over a little bit of what it is that he knows. And then the Alter Rebbe continues, and he says another aspect of this word netzach, this concept of netzach, is to win. So the Hebrew word netzach, lenetzach, and even in modern day Hebrew, means to win. So what does that mean? It means to prevail against any thing that is opposing, anything that might be holding back this influence of the learning to his son from whether from the inside or whether from the outside. So meaning if there's any kind of obstacle, any kind of like internal resistance or external resistance, then the netzach is the power of endurance that's there to overcome whatever resistance is here. So now the Alter Rebbe specifies, what do we mean by internal resistance? So you might have thought that we meant internal resistance on the part of the son, like the son has a mental block or something. But the Alter Rebbe actually says what he means by internal resistance is actually coming from the Father, that the Father has the attribute of gvura, of symptom of like a constriction inside, like a judgmental kind of thing within the Father that might cause all these contentions to rise up against his son, to say that he's not yet fit to know these things. Like, you know, the Father might be like, really, like, is my son smart enough? Does he merit really knowing this knowledge that I'm about to teach him? And then Netzach is there to actually push aside this resistance within the Father so that the Father will overcome whatever internal resistance he has to teaching his son and actually make sure that his son learns what it is that he's going to be teaching him. So I thought that was really interesting. And then now here an interesting thing comes up in the Tanya where it says that there's a note in the manuscript that there's a something missing here. So what is missing? So there's different interpretations as to what's missing. First of all, there's no explanation as to what the external resistance is, which is could be important to know. What do we mean by external resistance? Do we mean like traffic? Do we mean like outside influences, other teachers, whatever, is it the child's own thoughts? Is that external resistance? We don't know. So that part is actually missing in the script. Alternatively, another explanation as to what's missing here in the manuscript is that there's no explanation of Hod, of the corresponding power of Hod. So we know that just like Chesed, the kind of counterpart to Chesed is Gvura, the counterpart to Netzach is Hod. And there's no real explanation as to what Hod is. One way to understand this without the explanation being there is that Hod is kind of like encompassed within Netzach, like it's kind of like, because it is just like the counterpart of Netzach, maybe it doesn't have to be spelled out, I'm not sure, but it is kind of something that's missing. Anyway, so now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he gets to the next attribute. So what's the next attribute after Netzach and Hod? So again, just to give a little review of the topography that we have so far. So right at the upper right-hand corner, we have Chesed. Then we have the left corner, the upper left corner is Gvura. Then underneath those two in the middle we have Tiferet or Rachamim. Then we have underneath that Tiferet Rachamim, we have Netzach and Hod. So Netzach is on the right side underneath it, and Hod is on the left side. And we liken these two aspects of Netzach and Hod actually to the testicle, where the semen is prepared and where the semen is kind of like transmitted through the brain. So now we have the sixth attribute. What's the sixth attribute that's below Netzach and Hod and is in that middle place below Netzach and Hod? That's the attribute of Yesod. And Yesod literally means foundation in English, but again, as I've mentioned before, translations are very inadequate because there's a lot more to Yesod than just being foundation. It connotes the idea of connection, like a very deep bond, and that's what the Alter Rebbe is going to focus on here. Is he says that we can see this as Yesod. What is this in this analogy of the father and son? The father teaching the son. This is the deep bond that the father has with the son in connecting his intellect with the intellect of the son, while he's teaching him with love and with will, because he really, really wants his son to learn. And the Alter Rebbe says that this will, this love, which really is like the essential components of this bond, is essential to the child's understanding. Because, like, let's say if you had a scenario where the father was not teaching the son, but the son was just like in the periphery and the father was learning to himself and he was kind of saying the words out loud. And let's say he said the exact same words out loud that he would have said to the son wouldn't necessarily take it in the same way. He wouldn't necessarily understand them, at least not as well as he's understanding them when the father actually speaks to the son in a face-to-face manner, and he actually like consciously connects his mind to the mind of the son with love and with yearning, because so that he really, really wants his son to understand, like this gets translated. So this is like, if anybody's a teacher, if anybody's an educator, this is something important to know, that it's not just about teaching, is not just about conveying information. The students can sense if you feel it or not, if you really want them to understand how passionate you are about the topic that you're teaching, and about wanting them to understand what it is that you're teaching them. And this is actually going to affect how well your students will grasp the information at hand. And then there's just a little technical side note here that the Alter Rebbe puts in, that there's a mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek entitled Ki Dativ. And in section 13 of the mimer, this whole section of the Tanya is quoted, but for some reason, he omits this idea of the father teaching to himself or learning to himself. And one explanation as to why it is that the Tzemach Tzedek specifically, he purposefully omitted this idea of the father learning to himself and the son just overhearing, to emphasize that it's not only in that case that the son won't necessarily absorb the information, but even if the father is teaching the son, let's say the father is not just talking to himself, but he's actually teaching the son, if he doesn't have this element of Yesod, even if he has all the other elements that we spoke about, even if he has this, he went through the Chesed process, he decided he wants to give over the information. He went to the Gvura process, how he can't really give over all the information that he wants to give over. He went through the Rachamim process of, okay, how can I make this information, give it over in such a way that I'm not overpowering the child, but I'm still giving over the information. Then he went through the Netzach and Hod aspect of it, where he really figured out like the details as to how it is specifically he's going to give over the information, in what format and what manner. If he doesn't have the Yesod, which is the Yesod is the actual connective part where he bonds with his child, where there's an intimacy there, then it's not going to happen. The child's just not going to absorb the information in the ultimate best way. And not only that, but there's actually like a correlation between how much how strong his desire is to teach and how much the child's going to learn. So the greater the desire and the pleasure that the father has in teaching these things to his child, the greater will be this influence and this learning and this teaching. The more the child will be able to receive, and the more this father will be able to give. So there's a real relationship between this yearning and this pleasure that the father has. This actually will cause the father's intellect to expand, to become widened, and he'll have the knowledge. He'll be able to have this knowledge to be able to give it over and teach it to his son. And then in conclusion here, the Alter Rebbe brings a parenthesis where he says that this actually parallels the physical aspect of the attribute of Yesod. So the physical aspect of Yesod, so Yesod is often associated with physical intimacy, with sexuality. And the Alter Rebbe says that in the intimate act, what happens is that when the male, we talked again about the testicle, so then we have the actual sperm and it coming out, it comes through the mind. So there's an intellectual component to intimacy. It's not just like a physical thing, right? And so it's like the more, basically on a very simple level, it's like the greater the man's desire for the woman, the more intense will this intimate act be. And this is why, says the Alter Rebbe, that the Kabbalists likened the giving over of intellectual knowledge to the act of physical intimacy. Like, you might not have thought that there's a connection there, but the Kabbalists saw that there was a connection, and this will be explained. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to go on and tell us how it is that these emotive attributes that we've been discussing, how they're actually external manifestations of something a little bit more internal, and also that connection, as we spoke about in the introduction, that they have to the intellect. But before we get there, I want to just point out something about the emotional attributes and the way that the Alter Rebbe broke it down here, something that struck me, namely that it seems like the list that he gives here is a little bit incomplete, because we talked about there being 7 core emotions and we only spoke about 6. Chesed 1, Gvura 2, Tiferet or Rachamim 3, Netzach 4, Hod 5, Yesod 6. What about the 7th one? The 7th one is Malchus, and that is omitted for some reason. And there isn't really an explanation given as to why it's omitted. I could say perhaps, maybe my thought on the matter, but take it as you want, is that perhaps it's because Malchus is sort of like a composite of the other six, that it's really just the actualization of the other six, but it doesn't really have its own like substance in its own right the way the other six do, something like that. And really, honestly, I don't really know. And I do know that Malchus, as we've learned a little bit already, and I'm pretty sure it's going to come up later on as well. We have learned about Malchus in its own right, kind of from a different angle. So it is another thing to know that there is this seventh attribute of Malchus. So the Alter Rebbe says that these 7 emotive attributes that we've been discussing, these are the aspects of the externality of the soul. And within them is vested the internal attributes. What are the internal attributes? These are the aspects of love and fear, etc. He doesn't say what the etc. is. And as we'll learn, that's really because the love and fear is kind of like the main internal attributes. So meaning to say, how can we understand this? So Alter Rebbe gives us an example of how this manifests. So a very common example that's brought up in Tanya, you may have noticed a lot, is the imagery of a father and a son. So in the case of a father and a son, says the Alter Rebbe, the father, let's say you have a father who wants to bestow to his son. He wants to give to his son. Why does he do this? He does this out of love, right? That's the motivating factor usually in terms of when a father wants to give to his son. And why would a loving father want to hold back from giving to his son in some way? This is out of fear. This is because he's scared. He doesn't want to bring him into some kind of downfall, God forbid. So he may refrain from exposing the son to certain things, for example, right? So it's like there's certain things that the father is going to show the son and teach to the son, and some things he's going to hold back from teaching to the son because he wants to protect him. So it's coming from a fear place. So that's really, the Alter Rebbe says, is the core of the internal aspects of all of the external emotions that we discussed is really this internal place, this place of love and fear. Now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says, now the root of all of these emotions, whether we're talking about the internal emotions or the external emotions, is actually coming from the minds, from the intellect, from the chokhmah, bina, and das that's in the person's soul. And so we spoke about these previously, but I'll give a brief breakdown now of what they are. And again, these words, the translations just do not do these words justice at all. And these concepts, each one of these concepts, chokhmah, bina, and das, it's like Sfarim have been written about them, lectures have been given. It's like there's so much more to learn with every single one of these things. But on a really small, like simplistic level, just to give you kind of an idea of what each one of these things, what each one of these intellectual attributes mean. So we have chokhmah. Chokhmah can be thought of as like intuition. It's like the intuitive spark. Like when you know something intuitively, it's an intellectual knowledge. It's something you know, but you can't quite break it down. Like, let's say if you just like, you see somebody and you get this feeling, you can't trust them, or you get this. So it's a feeling, but it's an intellectual feeling. Or it's like you're working on a project and you're trying to figure out some problem that you're working on. And then you like get it. It's that like aha moment where you figured it out, but you can't quite explain it to anybody else. You can't quite break it down yet. Then you have Bina. Bina is the elaboration. Bina is the analysis. This is all the details of the concept, all of the details of what it is that you're thinking about. That's the Bina. And then you have the Das. That's the third one. The Das is it's translated as knowledge. And really the best way to understand it is integration. It's the bridge between the mind and the emotions. It's where it becomes personal, where the knowledge isn't just some theoretical thing anymore, but it's actually something that is real and true to you in a true way. Okay, so now what's the connection between the minds and the emotions? So the Alter Rebbe says that there's a connection. There is a connection. There's actually a relationship, a correlation between the person, the intellect of a person, and that is what's going to make their emotions as they are. As we see, so he says we see this in actuality, for example, with a child. So a child, their chokhmah, bina, and das, their intellects, they're small. They're in Hebrew, we call it katnos. It's like petty. Like children, they don't know that much, right? So they're sort of petty. Their knowledge is very small. And so thus, what do they care about? How do their emotions get displayed? In small things. Like they don't really care for lofty goals. It's like the famous example that people give. It's like you show a little baby a piece of chocolate cake and then $100 bill, and you give them the choice where to go to. They're going to go to the chocolate cake without realizing that the $100 bill could actually buy lots of cake, right? So it's like they don't understand the value of things so much. And that is because their intellect is not fully developed. And so too, not only with children, but we know even with adults as well. There's a phrase, and there's a citation here from Mishlei chapter 12, verse 8. Lefi sichlo yehulad ish. That according to the intellect, to a person's intellect, is a person praised. So meaning to say that it's like, you can get a sense of a person's intellect based on what they care about. That's the easiest way to explain it. It's like, do people care? Does a person care about petty things, or do they care about more refined, lofty kind of things? Where do they place their value in their life? And that is going to parallel their intellect. And so the Alter Rebbe elaborates on this, and he says that because according to the extent of a person's chokhmah, like the wiser a person is, that is going to manifest in how great their love and how great their giving is going to be. So meaning to say, on a very simple level, it's like a very wise person is going to most likely love more, because it's like think about it, like what makes a person not so loving sometimes is because they're not very wise. It's because they don't really have an understanding of other people. They're like sort of shallow minded. Somebody who's a little bit more open minded, somebody who's a little bit wiser and is able to see beyond just the surface, that is going to make a person into a more loving person and to a more giving person. Which, as a side note, that's why, one remedy really for trying to be a nicer, kinder person is really to develop this trait of just trying to become wiser. So we see this in actuality with very wise scholars. Like, how many very wise scholars do you know who are not very loving people? Like, it's not very common. It tends to go together, and this is the reason for this. And so that he gives this example of love being related to chokhmah, but the Alter Rebbe says that this is actually true for all of the emotive attributes, whether we're talking about the internal attributes or the external attributes. Their sources all come from the intellect. There's a connection to the intellect. Their root, their source is from the intellect. And the main part of the intellect that we're concerned with, says the Alter Rebbe, is the das, the third one. The one that, again, we translated as knowledge, but really better to be understood as the idea of integration, of attachment, of having the knowledge be personal. Because this das, so this comes from the chokhmah and bina. So it's like you have the chokhmah, and then you have the bina, and then the baby, the child that results from it, is the das. And this das is the bridge between the mind and the emotions. And that's why developing a person's das is so important. And the Alter Rebbe concludes that we see this in actuality. So interestingly, the word das, another translation of the word das is opinion. If you have an opinion, that's your das. In modern day Hebrew people say that, like, ma datcha, like, what do you think about this? What's your opinion on this? So different people have different opinions, and these different opinions that they have is going to influence what they feel, what they're emotional about, right? So this is a very simple way to understand this idea of the connection between a person's intellect and their emotions, is that a person's values, what they care about, what they're passionate about, is connected to the opinions that they have on different matters. We see this in political conversations all the time, right? Like, who are the people that tend to care the most about recycling? Who are the people that tend to care the most about guns? Who are the people that tend to care the most about eliminating taxes or reducing taxes? Like, I don't want to get into a political discussion, and I'm not giving opinions on any of these things, but we see that whatever your opinion is, you can think about this for a moment for yourself. If you have a political opinion that's very strong, it makes you feel emotional whenever you talk about it. You're going to get passionate about it. It's not just some intellectual, theoretical thing. So that's why das is such an essential thing, because without the das, the intellect is very cold. The intellect still has the potential to birth emotions, but it can only do so with the help of das, because otherwise, sure, you can talk about like political theory from today till tomorrow, but if it's not personal to you, like if you talk about if people talk about like political situations in different countries, chances are if they don't know anybody there, and if they're not like hugely involved in politics, they're not going to get as passionate about political discussions that take place in their home country right here, because that's something that's a lot more personal to them. And so thus the connection to the emotions is much more evident and much more straight without hindrance, because it's coming from that DOS. So that's it for today. So hopefully that was enlightening to you and gave you a little bit more of an insight into where our emotions come from. And we'll continue with this tomorrow. And tomorrow we're actually going to conclude this epistle. So stay tuned and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.